Welcome to Life is Beautiful. I'm Anthony. Today we're going to be doing another style guideline overview, and we're going to be talking about a wheat beer that I have a particular fondness for, but I don't think people really know the difference between it and any other type of wheat beer style coming out of Europe, and that is the wonderful, magical Belgian Witbier. And it's rather depressing because the Belgian Witbier has absolutely so much to offer. Unfortunately, I think it often gets lumped into other European wheat beer categories such as the German Hefeweizen. Now don't get me wrong, I love a well-made Hefeweizen, but the Belgian Witbier is not very similar other than the fact that it is pretty aromatic. It does have a lot of phenolics. It is made out of yeast, but that's kind of where the similarities end. Although the Belgian Witbier is very different than the German Hefeweizen, it has a ton in common with the French Blanc or Blanche beer. And that's because they're the exact same beer style. The only difference is the language in which it's pronounced. Dutch or Flemish is wit, and the more French speakers is Blanche. And this is very important because both French and Dutch are commonly spoke in Belgium. So of course it's going to go by both names. So if you've ever had a Belgian wit, but not a Blanc, or if you've ever had a Blanc and not a wit, you've actually had both. So if you ever try to do any research on the history of wheat beer, it always comes back to the same story. It's like the same paragraph in every book and every news article. It's always going to say that wheat beer had been brewed in Europe for centuries. Ever since brewing practices were started, wheat was sometimes included along with barley and millet and any other type of grain. But over time, we started to see those lump of grains kind of be divided up a little bit more. And eventually over time, we started seeing beers that were predominantly utilizing wheat. Now in Belgium, this is particularly important because in Belgium there is a long history of Groot beer brewing practices. Groot, if you don't know, is a beer style, more like a rough category of beers that were brewed before the wide adoption of hop utilization. Instead, they would use different herbs, different spices, all these different things that would enhance the flavor and aromatics, as well as potentially causing some inebriating or enhancing components or properties, as well as some, like juniper, being kind of antiseptic. As we continue to progress through time, we started seeing the widespread adoption of sun-dried malts as opposed to smoke fire-powered kilns. So we started seeing beers that became much paler. We started seeing beers that lost its smoky touch, and then we saw that widespread adoption of hops that I mentioned earlier. It was at that point that we would start to get the common ancestor of all wheat beers, light in color, predominantly wheat-based, with a good hop touch to it, and pale. Now, where the wit beer kind of connects the modern day to the historic is that it really did not lose its utilization of spices and herbs. Orange rind, citrus rinds as a whole, really, coriander seeds, chamomile are all very commonplace. So in a way, it is kind of a fusion between the ancient Groot beers of Belgium and the modern day European wheat beers. And that's kind of what makes it special. In terms of sensory characteristics, the wit beer is similar to the Hefeweizen, however retains that distinctive Belgian influence. The dense white head, hazy gold color, huge yeasty aromas, and immense quaffability would all feel familiar to a Hefeweizen lover. However, it's the execution of these sensory characteristics that really helps separate it. The wit beer is much more attenuated than the Hefeweizen. The body is a bit lighter and drier, which makes the carbonation a bit more intense. Now, where a well-made Hefeweizen will have a good amount of chew to it, a fuller body, the wit beer is distinctively drier and cleaner. It makes it way more sessionable. Oats are also commonly utilized in wit beer brewing, which helps mellow out that intense sizzle, and it also gives the body a touch of a silkier feeling, so it's not a full-on assault, more of an aggressive greeting. The wit beer's flavor and aroma is typical of European wheat beers, with a huge phenolic and ester yeast note of banana, bubblegum, clove. However, as mentioned, the wit beer accentuates these flavors as Belgian brewers are keen to do. They use spice in their wheat beers. Dried citrus pills, chamomile, coriander seeds are all common and play incredibly well with the natural characteristics of the yeast. The malt is a bit of a second fiddle to the yeast. You are going to get a little bit of a crackery feel, but that yeast is always going to be the star of the show. The aromatic qualities is such a critical component to Witbier that while I was drinking them in the Netherlands, they actually provided you some type of rod, like a Witbier stomper, where you're able to actually agitate your beer a little bit. That way the aroma gets bolstered and stronger. Just be a little careful, because if you overdo it, your beer will overfoam. The alcohol range is typically in the 4 to 5% ABV, and hops play a small yet still noticeable role in the Witbier, providing an earthy and additional spice notes typical of European hops. However, neither should ever distinctively stand out. They're meant to accentuate the overall flavor. You're never going to want to take away from the big yeast presence. So honestly, even though there is a desire to kind of put parallels up against the Hefeweizen and the Witbier, I would say that they're less so brothers. They're not siblings. They're more so cousins. In the late 1600s, we'd see the rise of beers that we could recognize in the modern era as Belgian wit beers. They rapidly became one of the most popular beer styles across the entire nation of Belgium. You know, there were certainly pockets where they were more popular, where the vast majority of brewers primarily focused on wheat beer production, particularly in towns like Hoegaarden. In fact, the city of Hoegaarden, which is predominantly famous for its Hoegaarden brand wit beer, they were so enamored by the wit beer production that at one point in time, they had over 20 breweries dedicated to brewing wit beer. So from the 1700s till the 1900s, the wit beer absolutely dominated as one of the best-selling, most popular beer styles that that country could produce. Things did get a little bit more complicated. A lot more complicated, to be honest, in the early 1900s because of the world wars. The back-to-back world wars and all the agricultural, industrial, and financial hardships caused by it caused extreme damage to the Belgian brewing industry as a whole, to include the producers of wit. Additionally, at this point in time, Belgian brewers were constantly fighting off the ever-encroaching rise of the Pilsner. The Pilsner for centuries prior had absolutely dominated, sweeping across all of Europe and eventually the world. However, it was Belgium that was a staunch holdout. So we started seeing what we saw across the rest of Europe hundreds of years prior. Traditional brewing practices started being pushed to the wayside for the ever-popular German Helles and the Bohemian Pilsner. Those two beer styles were essentially an extinction event for traditional brewing styles across all of Europe, but regardless of how hard Belgium tried to fight it off, they too fell victim. In 1957, the last wit beer brewery in Hoegaarden closed its doors for good, and the wit beer went functionally extinct. Fortunately, that was only for a very short period of time because there was one man, a Mr. Celis, Pierre Celis to be specific. He loved the wit beer so much he could not stand to see it die, and he was destined, determined to bring it back. Mr. Celis was an obvious devout fan of the wit beer, and luckily he did have a lot of experience brewing the style at his neighbor's brewery before all the mass closures. So when he took it upon himself to start brewing, it was a very rustic operation. He didn't have a brewery to go to. So he actually started brewing it in like wash tubs on his farm in a barn. Now that probably was a far cry from the professional environment he was used to, but he was obviously onto something quite good. He experimented for about 4 years, brewing different batches out of his wash tub. But there was one unique thing that he did that was different from the historical wit beers. Historically, many sources say that wit beers did have some sour notes to it, and that was likely caused by wild and uncontrolled fermentation that allowed lactobacillus to grow, creating lactic acid. So traditional historic wit beers were probably a touch tart, kind of more similar to a Berliner Weiss than anything. But He didn't necessarily want that. He wanted to brew a nicer, cleaner beer. And I don't have an exact reason for why he wanted to do that, but if I had to assume, it was likely so that he could compete with the incredibly clean Pilsner. And he was obviously onto something quite good, because in 1966, he was able to secure a loan, open up a brewery, and release his batch to the world, and it became the famed Hoegaarden brand Witbier. The Hoegaarden Witbier was such a phenomenon. You know, it was insanely popular. People loved to see the reemergence of such a classic beer style. And essentially, Mr. Celis's recipe completely redefined what the Witbier was. He brought it into that modern era. It still kept the core essence of what people loved, but it was changed and adapted to fit the modern palate. Nostalgia combined with the desires and demands of the modern day consumer, how could you fail? Mr. Celis's Hoegaarden Witbier was incredibly popular, so successful so that it essentially revived the style. Other breweries started bringing their Witbier recipes back, and by 1980, he was actually able to expand into a massive production factory. However, things couldn't stay great forever, and in 1985, the Hoegaarden brand and Mr. Celis in particular suffered a devastating fire which destroyed much of his new production facility, as well as a lot of the critical equipment required to brew Witbier. To make matters worse, the factory was dramatically underinsured, so Mr. Celis had to take all his personal money and all the profits from the brewery and put it back into reestablish it, get things back into production, which took a huge financial toll on him. The only way he could see staving off bankruptcy was to go into business with another major brewery, and that brewery was Stella Artois. However, things rapidly changed because Stella would eventually merge with other breweries, eventually forming the brewing conglomerate known as Interbrew. If you know anything about Interbrew, they were a Belgian-based brewing conglomerate that had brands and portfolios all across Europe, but they eventually merged with InBev down in Brazil to become the massive InBev. After all the dust had settled, Mr. Celis found himself in an unhappy situation. He really did not like how that whole conglomerate was primarily profit focused. They tried to cut corners on how to produce Witbier, change the ingredients, change the recipe, and Mr. Celis would constantly butt heads with them. You know, he was a lover of the Witbier and he wanted to keep it true, but, you know, he had bosses now, and the bosses have bottom lines that they have to meet, and concessions were made. But Mr. Celis would not take this laying down. What he ended up doing was selling all of his shares, all of his ownership, all of his stake in the Hoegaarden Witbier brand to AB InBev, and he took his profits and he moved to America. That had to have been incredibly painful and incredibly hard for Mr. Celis to make that decision. But he was not willing to let Witbier die. As he arrived in America, he opened up another brewery that was going to focus on brewing Witbier. Except this time it was labeled in the English nomenclature as white beer. Now, this was the early 1990s. Craft beer was still just kind of like this obscure thing on the fringes of beer drinking culture. You know, the homogenized nature of big beer was absolutely got a stranglehold on the beer industry in America. But that did not deter him. He wanted to release his Celis brand white beer to the masses, and he did pretty well for himself. He might not be talked about in the same breath as many of the early craft beer pioneers such as like Mitz Freytag, but he was incredibly essential to the early adoption of craft beer. I mean, he was brewing white beer in Texas, and he did quite well for himself. Many sources say that he struggled to meet demand sometimes. So again, he decided that he needed help to expand his operations, and he went back into business with big beer, this time with Miller. Unfortunately, the Celis white beer brand befell the same fate as his beloved Hoegaarden. The brewing execs started demanding concessions and changes in recipes to expand production, enhance, profitability, whatever. And again, Mr. Celis refused. So he sold all of his stakes, the names to his brand, his recipes to Miller, and this time he went back to Belgium for retirement. Although it is depressing to see that same story play out again, I would say that this one does have a bit of a happier ending because Miller eventually started to consolidate their profile, started selling off assets, and through a series of mergers and closures, eventually the Celis beer brand name came back to the Celis family, this time under the ownership of Mr. Celis's daughter. So still to this day, you can drink Mr. Celis's original Witbier white beer recipe from the Celis brewery in Texas, coming from the Celis family. That's a pretty happy ending if I could say so myself. Now I know that we started this video off talking about Witbier as a whole, and then we kind of narrowed in specifically on Mr. Celis and his Hoegaarden and his Celis beer brand efforts, but sometimes a beer style is so intrinsically linked to one brand of beer or possibly one individual who make it their mission to redefine the style. And you cannot talk about Witbier and its history without talking about Mr. Celis. He essentially revived the style in Belgium. I mean, if you buy any Witbiers, you're going to be drinking something that was somehow inspired by Mr. Celis and his re-innovation of the style. I mean, I don't think there are many lactic traditional historical Witbiers on the market. I mean, they're pretty much all in the style of Mr. Celis. Additionally, he was the one who brought white beer to America. I mean, if you've ever had a white IPA, that's essentially an overly hopped white beer that was created by Mr. Celis's recipe. He was a foundational player in this style's adoption across the globe. If it wasn't for Mr. Celis and his efforts, we wouldn't have the major beer brands like Blue Moon, Shock Top. We wouldn't see the craft interpretations like Allagash White. You know, it's all based around him. Needless to say, the Witbier, which was once considered to be an extinct beer style, is now thriving in the modern era. I mean, breweries around the globe find it to be an incredibly profitable beer style. You know, people flock to it. It's so easy drinking, it's lighter, and it's easily acceptable by people who might not really be into craft beer styles. So thank you for watching, everybody. I really hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something about the Witbier style and Mr. Celis and all of his hard work. If you've never had a Witbier and you are a fan of the Hefeweizen, I highly encourage you, give it a try. Anyways, remember, there's a story in every bottle and that life is beautiful. Cheers.